The grand lobby of the new conservatory felt less like a room and more like a beautiful echoing cage. Light poured in through towering windows, bouncing off the polished marble floors so brightly it hurt the eyes. The air didn't just hold sound. It felt thick with it. Not with music yet, but with the buzz of 100 whispered conversations, the rustle of expensive clothing, and the sharp, nervous tap-tap-tapping of fingers on knees, on chair arms, on imaginary keyboards. It was audition day. You could taste the ambition in the room, sharp and metallic. They were all so young, the hopefuls. They sat in clusters, islands of anxiety and hope. A young man with hair styled to perfection wore a suit that probably cost more than most people's rent. He was doing silent, frantic scales in the air, his fingers a blur. Next to him, a young woman with a severe bun and a black dress that screamed serious artist had her eyes closed, humming a complex passage from some concerto, her head nodding to a silent beat. Parents hovered like elegant, worried ghosts, offering sips of water, adjusting collars, and whispering last-minute advice. Remember your phrasing, sweetheart. Breathe. Just breathe. Teachers, looking almost as nervous as their students, pointed sternly at sheet music, mouthing reminders. And then there was her. She sat alone on a plain wooden bench, pushed against a far wall. Underneath, a dramatic painting of some old, frowning composer. She seemed to be trying to fold herself into the shadows, to take up less space. Her coat was a dull, practical brown, worn thin at the elbows. It was clean, but it had clearly seen many winters. Her shoes were sensible, flat and polished to a quiet shine. On her lap, she held not a fancy binder or a tablet, but a simple portfolio of cracked, chestnut brown leather, its corners softened from years of use. Her hands, resting on top of it, were interesting. They weren't the delicate, untouched hands of a young prodigy. They were strong-looking, capable hands. The fingers were long, but there was a slight roughness to them, a story in the faint lines and the neat, short nails. She didn't fidget. She didn't hum. She just watched. Her eyes, a calm gray blue, moved slowly around the room, taking in the scene. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a kind of quiet observation, as if she were remembering something from a very long time ago. A girl in a puff of tulle skirt, clutching a stuffed toy, pointed her out to her mother. The mother, dressed in a sleek pantsuit, glanced over, gave a barely perceptible shrug, and gently turned her daughter's head away, back towards the more relevant competitors. The young man in the expensive suit finished his air scale and let out a long, dramatic sigh. The wait is torture, he announced to his friend, another young man clutching a violin case. I just want to get in there and show Renaud what real passion sounds like. I heard he crushed that last girl. She came out in tears. His friend nodded, adjusting his cufflinks. It's brutal, but that's the big leagues. You have to have the spine for it. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the woman on the bench. A faint smirk touched his lips. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that was perfectly calculated to carry. Speaking of leagues, what do you think her story is? Did someone's, housekeeper get the wrong room? A few people nearby heard it. A snicker came from a group of teens. The mother in the pantsuit allowed herself a small, tight smile. It was nervous laughter, the kind that comes from a place of shared anxiety. Making fun of someone so clearly out of place was a way to feel a little more in. The woman on the bench, Ilara, heard it. A very slight movement went through her, not a flinch, but a slow, deep breath that lifted her shoulders and then let them fall. Her fingers stroked the worn leather of her portfolio once, a soothing gesture. She didn't look at the young man. She didn't glare or show any anger. She simply looked down at her own hands, turning them over as if checking them for something. A tiny, almost invisible smile touched the corners of her mouth, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile of recognition, of a very old, familiar feeling. The door to the inner sanctum, the audition room, opened with a heavy click. All noise in the lobby died instantly. A stern-faced woman with a clipboard appeared. Every single person leaned forward, a wave of desperate hope rolling through the crowd. "Number 47, the clipboard woman called out, her voice like a judge's gavel, a collective slump. Not their number. The buzz returned, louder now, charged with fresh relief and renewed dread. Ilara watched the chosen one, a boy who looked about 16, pale as paper, stand up on shaking legs. His teacher gave him a forceful thumbs up. He vanished through the heavy door, and it shut behind him, swallowing him into the silence where judgments were made. The wait continued. The young man in the suit started cracking his knuckles. The girl with the bun was now silently crying, her mother dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Ilara just sat. She watched the sunlight move slowly across the floor. She listened to the fragments of conversations, the boasts, the fears. The names of famous pianists tossed around like TALISMANS. Another boy, trying to impress a group of girls nearby, said loudly, "I'm playing the Ratch 3 cadenza. The Ossia, of course. The harder one. Renaud will respect that." Ilara's eyes closed for just a moment. A memory flickered not of fear, but of a similar room, a different time. That same burning need to announce what you're going to play, to use the composer's name like a weapon. She remembered how exhausting that felt. Time stretched and twisted. Some people paced. Some prayed. Ilara remained a still point in the turning, anxious world. She was like a stone in a fast-moving stream, with all the chaos and sparkle flowing around her, unaware of the depth and weight that lay beneath her quiet surface. Finally, the stern woman with the clipboard appeared again. She looked down at her list, and her eyes swept across the room, past the bright, expectant faces, and landed on the quiet corner by the old painting. "Number 52, she announced. "You may enter the holding area now." All eyes followed the woman's gaze. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Number 52 was the woman in the faded coat. For the first time, Ilara moved with purpose. She stood up, smoothing her simple skirt. She picked up her old leather portfolio. She didn't look at anyone as she walked, her sensible shoes making soft, solid sounds on the marble. The path from her bench to the clipboard woman felt very long. She passed the young man in the suit. He didn't smirk now. He just stared, his mouth slightly open, as if a background character had suddenly been called to the main stage. She reached the stern woman, who gave her a brief, impersonal nod and held the inner door open. Ilara stepped through into a smaller, quieter hallway. The door swung shut behind her, cutting off the buzzing lobby. The last thing the waiting room saw was her straight, unassuming back before the door closed. The silence she left behind was different now. The easy target was gone. For a few seconds, no one mocked her. They just looked at the closed door, a flicker of something uneasy in the air, before the nervous chatter slowly, tentatively, began to rise again. But the laughter had gone out of it. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing off the nervous murmur of the lobby. The hallway was short, dim, and cool. At the end of it was another door, heavy and dark. This was it, the final barrier. Ilara stood still for a moment, just breathing. She could hear nothing from the room beyond. That was the most intimidating sound of all, that perfect, judgmental silence. She walked forward, her footsteps quiet. She placed her hand on the cold brass handle, took one last deep breath that did nothing to calm the sudden, familiar flutter in her chest, and pushed, The audition room was a shock of light. After the dim hall, the sun streaming through tall windows was almost blinding. It was a large, beautiful room, all wood and elegance. The ceiling was high. The walls were lined with portraits of severe-looking men, past directors of the conservatory, their painted eyes seeming to follow her. And in the center of it all, glowing under a focused spotlight, was a magnificent grand piano. It was a beast of polished ebony, its surface a mirror reflecting the room. It looked less like an instrument and more like a sleeping god. Across the room, behind a long, imposing table of dark oak, sat the three judges. At the center was the man everyone knew from photographs, the legendary maestro. He was older, with a sharp, intelligent face and a head of thick silver hair. He was writing something in a notebook, his pen scratching loudly in the quiet. He did not look up. To his right was a woman, perhaps in her 50s, with a neat, professional bob and sharp eyes. She was a celebrated concert pianist, known for her technical perfection. She offered Alara a quick, thin smile that didn't reach her eyes before glancing back at her papers. To the maestro's left was a younger man, the composer in residence. He had a more open face, but it was currently etched with the deep weariness of a long day listening to incomplete performances. He rubbed his temples as Alara entered. The sight of her seemed to drain the last bit of energy from the room. The maestro finally looked up. His gaze was not unkind at first. It was simply blank. It swept over her faded coat, her sensible shoes, her worn portfolio. It was the look of a man categorizing, filing away. He saw no famous teacher, no wealthy patron, no dazzling young talent. He saw an administrative error. "Name and piece, please," he said. His voice was deep, tired, and utterly devoid of interest. It was the same tone he'd used for the last 51 candidates. "Alara Vance," she said. Her voice was clear but soft, a little rough from disuse. "I will play Islami, Oriental Fantasy by Miley Balakirev." For a second, there was only the hum of the overhead lights. Then the composer judge let out a sound, a short, choked puff of air that was almost a laugh. He quickly turned it into a cough, covering his mouth. He leaned forward, a flicker of something like concern or amusement in his tired eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "Did you say Islami? The Balakirev?" Alara simply nodded. The concert pianist woman gave a small dismissive shake of her head, looking down at her notes. It was a gesture that said, "We don't have time for this." The composer pressed on, a faint, disbelieving smile on his lips. "Ma'am, with respect, at peace. It's not just difficult. It's a monster. It's one of the most technically challenging pieces ever written for the piano. It's—" He searched for a word, his hands gesturing in the air as if trying to sculpt the complexity of it. "It's for virtuosos, competition winners. Are you absolutely certain that's your selection?" His question hung in the air. It wasn't a challenge to inspire her. It was a warning, a suggestion that she was making a fool of herself and wasting their precious time. He was giving her a chance to back out, to swap to something simpler, something more fitting for a woman who looked like she taught beginner lessons in a community center. Alara met his gaze. Her gray-blue eyes were calm. "I am certain," she said, her voice still soft, but now with a thread of something unyielding in it. The maestro had been watching this exchange with detached curiosity. Now he sighed, a long, weary exhalation. He looked at the clock on the wall. The day was dragging. He had heard too many clumsy Beethoven sonatas, too many rushed Chopin etudes. This promised to be a train wreck, and while part of him was morbidly curious, a larger part was just tired. He wanted his lunch. He wanted the day to be over. He waved his hand toward the glorious piano in the center of the room. It was a gesture of pure dismissal. "Very well," he said, his voice flat. "Whenever you are ready. We do not provide sheet music. You understand?" It was another barb, another assumption. That she had planned to use their music, that she wasn't prepared. Alara just nodded again. She hadn't brought any music because she didn't need any. She walked toward the piano. The space between the judge's table and the instrument felt vast. Her simple shoes were silent on the polished wood floor. She approached the magnificent beast of ebony and ivory, this symbol of a world that had once been hers and then hadn't been for so long. She didn't sit down immediately. She placed her old leather portfolio gently on the floor beside the bench. Then she reached out, and with a tenderness that looked almost like a greeting, she lifted the fallboard, revealing the perfect waiting keyboard. The keys were like a river of black and white stone. She didn't do any showy finger stretches. She didn't crack her knuckles or take dramatic breaths. She simply sat. The bench was firm. The piano loomed over her. For a long moment, she was completely still, her back straight but not stiff, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She looked at the keys, but she didn't seem to be seeing them. She seemed to be looking through them, or into some distant place only she could see. The judges watched. The maestro picked up his pen again, ready to write a quick, scornful note. The concert pianist stifled a yawn. The composer leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his expression one of resigned boredom. They had seen this before. The nervous pause. The gathering of courage before the inevitable stumble. The sunlight from the window cut across the floor, catching motes of dust that danced in the silent air. The portraits on the walls watched, unimpressed. Alara closed her eyes. She wasn't praying. She wasn't panicking. She was listening. Listening to the silence of the room, the faint echo of her own heartbeat in her ears. She was listening for the music that wasn't in the room, but was locked deep inside her, in a place she had sealed shut for 25 years. She was searching for the key dot. Her hands rose. They hovered over the keys, not trembling, but alive with a potential energy. They were her hands, the same strong, capable, slightly rough hands that had held the leather portfolio. There was nothing magical about them in that moment. They were just hands. And then she began. Her hands came down, not with a crash, but with a single, clear, perfect note. It hung in the sunlit air of the room, pure and round as a drop of water. It was just one note, but it had a quality to it, a depth of tone that seemed to pull the silence tighter around it. Then came another, and another. They were the opening bars of the Islami, but they sounded different than anyone in the room had ever heard them played. This wasn't the frantic, show-off sprint most pianists began with. This was a story. The notes were slow, deliberate, weaving a strange and beautiful melody that felt ancient. It was haunting. It was the sound of a wind crossing a vast, empty desert. It was a voice singing a lonely song from 1,000 miles away. The composer judge, who had been leaning back with his arms crossed, slowly uncrossed them. He didn't sit forward, not yet, but his head tilted. This wasn't what he expected. The maestro had put his pen down. He wasn't writing. He was listening. The concert pianist stopped looking at her notes. Her eyes were fixed on those hands. Ilara played on. Her body was still calm, but her fingers had come alive. They weren't just hitting keys. They were speaking, drawing pictures in the air. The gentle, exotic melody began to quicken, just a little. A sense of anticipation built, like clouds gathering on a distant horizon. Her left hand began a low, rumbling rhythm, a heartbeat from deep within the earth. Her right hand danced over it, the notes becoming brighter, more intricate. Then, without any visible effort, the storm broke dot. It happened so fast, the eye could barely follow. The quiet, storytelling melody exploded into a whirlwind of sound. Her hands became a blur. They flew across the keyboard in cascades of notes, so rapid they should have been a messy roar, but they weren't. Every single note was distinct, a tiny, perfect crystal in a crashing waterfall. The power coming from the piano was physical now. The judges could feel the vibrations in the floor. It was thunderous, passionate, wild, but it wasn't chaos. That was the impossible thing. Inside this hurricane of sound was absolute control. Every phrase had a shape. Every furious run had a destination. She wasn't just playing the notes fast. She was telling the story of the storm itself, the fury, the danger, the wild, exhilarating joy of it. The transformation in her was complete. The humble, faded woman on the bench was gone. In her place was a force of nature. Her back was straight as a rod, her shoulders powerful. Her face, which had been so blank, was now alight with a fierce concentration and a deep, painful kind of joy. Her eyes were open, fixed on some point far beyond the piano, seeing the deserts and mountains the music described. Sweat glistened at her temples. The maestro was no longer tired. He was rigid in his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table. His mouth was slightly open. He had heard this piece performed by world-famous pianists. He had played it himself in his youth, though never like this. This wasn't just technical mastery, though the technique was beyond flawless. This was the soul of the piece, something he had only read about in old reviews. It was raw, untamed, and heartbreakingly beautiful all at once. The concert pianist had both hands pressed flat against the tabletop as if to steady herself. Her professional detachment had shattered. Her eyes were wide, darting from Ilara's flying hands to her face and back. She was analyzing, trying to understand the mechanics, but she was being swept away by the emotion. She heard things she had tried for years to achieve in her own playing. A singing tone in the middle of a brutal passage. A whisper-soft chord that cut through the thunder, and this woman in a worn coat was doing them without a shred of apparent effort. The composer was leaning so far forward he was almost out of his seat. His earlier weariness and amusement were burned away by pure, unadulterated awe. He was a student of music history. He knew the legends. And what he was hearing, it was a ghost. It was a sound from a lost era of piano playing, a kind of fearless, romantic fire that wasn't taught in conservatories anymore. He watched her damaged right hand. He could see the faint, silvery lines of old scars, now as it moved, and his mind reeled. How was this possible? The music shifted again. The violent storm passed, melting into a section of profound, aching sadness. The notes became slower, dripping with a loneliness so deep it felt like a physical weight in the room. Ilara's body softened. The fierce light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a wet sheen. This wasn't just playing a sad part of a song. This was grief-given sound. Her fingers pressed the keys with such tenderness, it looked like she was trying to comfort them. A single, pure high note hung in the air, so quiet it was almost a thought, and it seemed to hold all the loneliness in the world. The maestro felt a cold chill go down his spine. He wasn't just hearing a performance. He was witnessing a confession. He saw the pain etched in the lines of her face as she played this section, a pain that was clearly personal and very old. Then, as if shaking off the memory, the music gathered itself. The sadness wasn't gone, but it was transformed into determination. The tempo began to climb again, not into the wild storm of before, but into a triumphant, relentless climb. It was a struggle upward. The left hand pounded out a heroic, marching rhythm. The right hand soared over it with brilliant, sun-bursting chords and scales that sparkled like shattered glass in the light. Ilara was fighting the piano now, and winning. Every muscle in her arms and back was engaged, but it was a controlled, powerful struggle. The final pages of Islami are a notorious beast, a final test that breaks many pianists. She attacked them not with brute force, but with a terrifying, graceful precision. The notes came in waves, each one louder, brighter, more impossible than the last. The room was filled with the sound of victory. It wasn't a happy victory. It was a victory earned through tears and struggle. It was the sound of someone crawling out of a deep, dark hole and finally seeing the sun, with a final, earth-shaking chord that made the windows rattle in their frames. It ended. The last note echoed, and then faded into a silence that was louder than any sound. Alara's hands fell from the keys and landed gently in her lap. Her head bowed. Her shoulders rose and fell with deep, ragged breaths. The powerful figure of a moment ago was gone, folded back into the small, tired woman in the faded coat. A single drop of sweat traced a path down her cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She just sat there, head down, as if she had poured her entire soul out onto the keyboard and was now just an empty shell. The three judges were frozen. Not a single one of them moved. The composer had tears in his eyes, though he didn't seem aware of them. The concert pianist had one hand over her heart. The maestro simply stared, his face pale, all traces of boredom or impatience completely erased, replaced by something like reverence and a dawning, horrifying recognition. The beautiful, sun-drenched room felt charged, like the air after a lightning strike. The dust motes still danced in the sunlight, but everything else had changed. The portraits of the old directors no longer looked stern. They looked like they were listening. No one spoke. No one knew what to say. The usual script, the polite, thank you, the critical note, the dismissal, was ashes in their mouths. They had come to judge an audition, and instead, they had been witness to something they knew, in their bones, was a piece of history, and they had almost sent it away. The silence that followed was not empty. It was thick, heavy, like a blanket that had smothered the entire world. The last shattering chord seemed to still be vibrating in the wood of the floor, in the bones of the judges, in the very air they struggled to breathe. Alara did not move. Her head remained bowed, her hands resting limply in her lap. She looked spent, hollowed out. The transformation was complete in reverse. The titan who had commanded the piano was gone, leaving behind the quiet, warm woman. The only signs of the tempest that had just passed were the slight tremble in her shoulders as she caught her breath and the damp track the single tear had left on her cheek. Across the room, the judges were statues. The concert pianist had both hands pressed flat against the table, her knuckles white. She was staring at Alara not as a judge, but as a student. Her mind, usually so quick to analyze and categorize, was a stunned blank. All she could think was, I have never in my life heard anything like that. I could practice for 100 years and not play a single phrase with that much. Truth. The composer was the first to break the physical stillness. He slowly lowered his forehead until it rested against his clasped hands on the table. His shoulders shook once, silently. He wasn't crying. It was the shudder of a man whose entire understanding of something had just been rewritten. He had studied Islami. He had written papers on its structure. He thought he knew what it was. Now he knew he had never understood it at all. The piece had just been explained to him in a language beyond notes. The maestro did not move a muscle. He was locked in his chair, his silver hair bright in the sunbeam that now fell across the judge's table. His eyes were fixed on the woman at the piano. They were wide, unblinking, swimming with a storm of emotions. Awe, shame, and a dawning, staggering realization. His mind was racing, tearing through decades of memories, through concert halls and recordings, trying to place the unplaceable. That sound. That particular, heartbreaking blend of thunder and silk, of wild abandon and absolute control. That specific way of making the melody sing above even the most furious passages. He had heard it before, only once. A long, long time ago. It was a sound that had defined an era of piano playing, and then it had vanished from the earth. His voice, when it finally came, was not the commanding bass of the great maestro. It was a dry whisper, a crack in the silence. It sounded old and terribly fragile. That? He began, then stopped. He cleared his throat, but the whisper remained. That interpretation, the phrasing in the second cadenza, the way you voiced the inner melody. He was speaking more to himself than to her, trying to piece it together. I have only ever heard its equal once. A very long time ago. He paused, the name almost too sacred, too painful, to utter in this sunlit room of casual judgment. It was from Elena Rostova. The name dropped into the silence like a stone into a still pond. The concert pianist gasped, a tiny, sharp intake of breath. Her hands flew to her mouth. Elena Rostova, the ghost. The greatest pianist no one under 40 remembered. The woman who had disappeared at the very peak of her fame, leaving behind only legendary recordings and a million unanswered questions. The composer lifted his head, his face pale. He looked from the maestro to the woman on the bench, his eyes begging for this not to be a cruel joke. Alara did not startle at the name. She didn't look up. She simply continued to sit, absorbing the sound of it. That name. It felt like a key turning in a rusty lock deep inside her. A wave of exhaustion, deeper than any she had felt in 25 years, washed over her. The fight was over. The secret was out. Slowly, with an effort that seemed to cost her dearly, she raised her head. The sunlight caught her face fully now. It illuminated the fine lines around her eyes and mouth, not as marks of age, but as a map of a hard-lived life. It showed the quiet dignity in her bearing, and the profound, unhealed sorrow in her gray-blue eyes. She looked directly at the maestro. Her gaze was clear, unwavering, and filled with a lifetime of memory. "Rostova," she said, her voice rough from the emotion and the physical effort, but calm. "That was my stage name. A long time ago." A soft, strangled sound came from the composer. The concert pianist simply stared, her mind refusing to connect the myth with the reality, sitting 10 feet away. The maestro felt the room tilt. He had said it, but hearing her confirm, it was a different kind of shock. It was like seeing a ghost step out of a photograph and breathe. "Elena?" He breathed, the professional title maestro, completely forgotten. Alara gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "That person. She's gone. That name belongs to the stage. I am Alara. I have been Alara for a very long time." She looked down at her hands, lying in her lap. She turned them over, studying the palms, the strong fingers, the faint, silvery scars that laced across the back of the right one, usually hidden, but now visible in the harsh light. "After the accident," she continued, her tone matter-of-fact, as if describing the weather, there was no more stage. "The car crash. It shattered my right arm. The surgeons said I might regain basic use. They said playing again, at any serious level, was impossible. A fantasy." She flexed the fingers of her right hand slowly, watching the tendons move. "But it did more than break bones. It broke everything. The confidence, the nerve, the sound in my head. I could hear the music, but my hands, they were strangers. They were broken tools. The world moved on. They called me tragically lost, then they forgot." She looked up again, and now her eyes were glistening. "I spent years in silence. Then I started again, in secret. Not as Elena Rostova. There was too much weight in that name. Too many expectations. I started as a beginner. Single notes. Simple scales. It was agonizing. It was humiliating. My own hands mocked me. But I could not live without it. The music was still in here. She touched her chest just once. It had just gotten trapped behind the fear. She took a long, shaky breath. So I practiced. Not for concerts. Not for an audience. For myself. In quiet rooms on old pianos. For 25 years. Rebuilding, relearning. Trying to forgive my hands for being broken. And forgive myself for being afraid. She gestured faintly toward the magnificent piano before her. This, today, is the first time I have played that piece, any piece like that, for anyone other than a wall in a quarter of a century. The truth of it settled over the room. 25 years. A lifetime of hidden, stubborn, private devotion. The judge's earlier dismissal, their bored impatience, their barely concealed smirks, they curdled in their stomachs, turning into an acid burn of shame. They had been ready to dismiss a humble woman, and in doing so, they had almost dismissed a monument. The maestro found he could not remain seated. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly on the floor. He stood up. He wasn't the imposing authority figure anymore. He was just a man, humbled to his core. You, he began, his voice choked. You came here to audition. For us? The question hung in the air, absurd and pathetic. The idea that this woman, this living legend who had just schooled them in the very essence of music, needed their approval for a spot in a freshman class was suddenly the most ridiculous thing any of them had ever considered. Ilara looked at him, and for the first time, a very small, very weary, but genuine smile touched her lips. It was a smile that held no malice, only a deep, quiet understanding. No, she said softly. I did not come for a student's place. She paused, letting her gaze travel over their stricken faces. I heard a rumor that the great new conservatory was searching, not for another child prodigy to put on a poster, but for a master in residence, someone to teach not just fingers, but heart, to remind students that music is not a sport. It is a language of the soul. Her eyes went back to the maestro. I am here, Ilara Vance, formerly Elena Rostova, said with quiet finality, to apply for that job. The words seemed to hang in the air, separate from everything else in the room. To apply for that job. They weren't spoken with pride or challenge, but with a simple, unshuckable certainty. It was a statement of fact, as plain as if she'd said the sky was blue. For a long moment, no one moved. The maestro remained standing behind the table, his hands braced on the dark wood as if for support. The concert pianist and the composer were still in their seats, utterly still, their faces pale canvases of shock. The echo of the music was gone, replaced by the echo of her story. A 25-year silence. A climb out of a deep, dark well, one painful note at a time. And Maestro was the first to break the spell. He didn't speak. Instead, he slowly walked out from behind the table. His steps were not the confident strides of the maestro, but the careful, almost reverent steps of a man approaching something sacred. He crossed the sunlit space between them, a dust motes dancing around him. He stopped a few feet from the piano bench. He looked at Ilara, really looked at her, not as a number or an oddity, but as a person. He saw the wear in her coat, the calm steadiness in her eyes, the quiet strength in her posture. He saw the hands that lay in her lap, the tools that had just rebuilt a shattered world. He did something then that no one in the conservatory had ever seen him do. He bowed. It wasn't a deep theatrical bow, but a slow, respectful inclination of his head and shoulders. It was an acknowledgement. From master to master. Elena. Ilara, he corrected himself, his voice thick. We had no idea. We? He stopped, seeming to realize that any apology, any explanation, would be too small, too cheap for what had just transpired. The dismissive wave of his hand, the bored sigh, they were now branded in his memory as his greatest professional shame. Behind him, the other two judges finally found their feet. They stood awkwardly, like children who had been caught in a terrible mistake. The concert pianist's eyes were red-rimmed. The composer simply looked overwhelmed, as if he'd been hit by a wave. Elara watched them, her expression gentle. There was no triumph in her face, no glimmer of "I told you so." If anything, she looked slightly sad for them, for the burden of their own embarrassment. She slowly rose from the piano bench. She seemed smaller again, but the air of quiet authority remained. It was no longer the authority of the stage, but the deeper, more solid authority of hard-won peace. "The students," she said, her voice soft but clear in the silent room. "The ones outside. The ones with the perfect suits and the frightened eyes." The judges flinched, remembering the young man's cruel whisper, the shared snickers. "They play the notes," Elara continued. "They play them very fast, very clean. They have been taught to conquer the piano, to win." She reached out and gently touched the fallboard of the magnificent instrument, her fingers tracing the polished wood. "But the piano is not an enemy to be conquered. It is a voice waiting to be found. My voice was lost for a very long time. I had to listen through the brokenness to find it again." She looked at the composer. "You asked me if I was certain about the piece. You were worried about the technical beast." She gave a small, sad smile. "The technique is just the door. The music is on the other side. These students, they are spending so much time polishing the door handle. They are afraid to turn it and walk through." The maestro nodded slowly, a lifetime of teaching dogma cracking apart inside him. He thought of the brilliant, empty performances he heard every year, all flash and no fire. He thought of his own youth, chasing fame, and realized with a sting that he, too, had once been polishing the handle. What would you do?" he asked, the question leaving him in a rush. "As master in residence, where would you even begin?" Elara looked toward the heavy door that led back to the world, to the lobby full of anxious talent. "I would begin by closing the lid," she said simply. "I would have them sit at the piano and not play a single note. I would ask them to tell me what the silence sounds like before the music begins. I would ask them what story their heart needs to tell, that only their hands can speak." She turned her gaze back to her own hands, flexing the fingers of her right one slowly. "I would show them these, not as a tragedy, but as a map. I would tell them that broken things can be mended, but only if you are not afraid of the cracks. That sometimes the most beautiful sound comes not from perfection, but from the note that carries a little of the struggle it took to play it." The composer let out a long, shaky breath. "They need that," he murmured, almost to himself. "My God, do they ever need that?" The concert pianist finally found her voice. It was hesitant, stripped of its usual sharp confidence. "The audition. The other candidates." She trailed off, gesturing helplessly toward the door. Elara understood. "My audition is over," she said. "You have work to do. They deserve your attention. They are just earlier on the path." The maestro shook his head, a new resolve hardening in his eyes. The shock was receding, replaced by a fierce, protective clarity. "No," he said, his voice regaining some of its old command, but softer now. "This changes everything. Today, now." He turned to the concert pianist. "Please go to the waiting room. Tell them the auditions are paused." An indefinite pause. "Offer them water. Apologize for the delay. Do not give a reason." He then looked at the composer. "Call the dean and the board chair. Tell them to come to my office immediately. Do not explain why. Just say it is the most important meeting of their careers." Both judges moved as if released from a trance, nodding silently, hurrying from the room with one last, awestruck glance at Elara. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Elara alone with the maestro. He turned to her. "Will you come with me? To my office? To speak with them?" Elara looked around the sunlit audition room, at the piano she had just brought to life, at the portraits of the frowning men. This room had been a chamber of judgment. Now it felt like a birthplace. "Yes," she said. She bent down and picked up her worn leather portfolio from the floor. She held it not like a shield, but like an old friend. "But first," she said, looking at the piano. "May I?" The maestro nodded. Not understanding that, she walked to the piano, opened the bench seat, and drew out the small, soft cloth kept inside for dusting. Gently, carefully, she wiped the keys where she had played, removing the faint traces of moisture from her hands. It was a ritual of respect, of closure. She closed the fallboard with a soft thud, putting the magnificent beast back to sleep. Then she turned to him, portfolio in hand. "I am ready." As they walked toward the door that led not back to the lobby, but to a private hallway, the maestro hesitated. "The job," he started. "It is yours. You must know that. There will be no committee, no vote. It is yours." Elara nodded. She had known from the moment she decided to come. This wasn't about getting a job. It was about coming home. "Thank you," she said. He held the door open for her. As she passed through, she paused for one last moment, looking back into the quiet, empty room. The sunlight still streamed in, but the storm was over. The air was clear. Out in the main hallway, the sound of hushed, confused voices filtered from the direction of the lobby. The young man in the expensive suit was probably checking his watch, annoyed. The girl with the severe bun was likely near panic. Their worlds were about to be tilted, though they didn't know it yet. The definition of what a master looked like, sounded like, had just been rewritten in the room behind her. Elara Vance straightened her simple coat. She didn't walk toward the voices of the future prodigies. She turned, instead, to follow the maestro down the quiet hall, toward a different kind of room, where a different conversation was about to begin. Her footsteps were soft, but solid on the marble floor. She was not leaving an audition. She was arriving